Hello and welcome to Creative Conversations from the Centre for Myth Cosmology and the Sacred. So these are conversations that a number of us have decided to explore with each other. And today I'm speaking to Dr Angela Voss, who is one of the co-founders of the Centre for Myth Cosmology and the Sacred, of which I'm also a part of. And I'm really looking forward to speaking to Angela, who I've known for a number of years now, and also studied under Angela's programme in Myth Cosmology and the Sacred MA at Canterbury University. I know Angela and I share a love together of Renaissance art and the Italian Florentine Renaissance in particular. But this conversation I'd like it to be informal and also explore a little more your background, Angela, your childhood through your teen years, what led you to do what you do today, and how you arrived at this point, and whether there were certain turning points in your journey and so forth. So welcome, and it's nice to talk to you again.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Mary.
So could you just say briefly now where you see yourself in your life and why you have decided to open and start this Centre for Myth Cosmology and the Sacred with us, which is an offshoot of the MA, but running programmes in a slightly different way, and with some new content as well.
Yes, okay. Well, I kind of feel flung into it by destiny, as I've felt all my life with projects, because the MA programmes at Canterbury came to an end, or the one at Christchurch is just coming to an end. So I took that as a sign for something new to happen, and that it was time to move on from trying to do what we were doing, within the confines of the academic walls, as it were. And so the end of the MA coincided with me being quite ill for a year and having to take months off, and then lockdown happening, and it suddenly felt like something new had to happen, and a new initiative had to happen that would take the work we were doing further and deeper and wider. And it seemed obvious that an online sort of web platform where we could offer courses and webinars, but also create an archive of everything we've done, or a lot of what we've done so far, is the next step. It just seemed completely obvious this would have to happen. And so that's how it kind of fell into place, and I just realized that it was possible, and we had the time to do it, and we had the resources, and we raised the resources really quickly in order to pay somebody to help us, pay Chrissy to help us set it all up. So it just felt like the right time. And I've always felt just very guided by a sort of intuitive sense in all this, that it was sad that the programme has ended at Christchurch, but it meant that it could now spread its wings, basically. So that's how it came about.
So you felt like it sort of had outgrown its former mould in a way,
I think so.
Needed to have another home and a different space within which to explore.
I think it had outgrown the kind of restrictions and conservatism of academic protocol, which took up so much time and so much energy. I think it needs a space where we can be far more experimental and adventurous, practice-based, just do all sorts of things that come from a sort of love and passion for what we're studying. We haven't got to worry about essays and marking, and we haven't got to worry about, all the kind of red tape that went on at the university. So I think it's a creative space, and it's got infinite potential, and it's really, really needed right now in our age. And the feedback we've had so far has been so positive in terms of helping people get through this difficult period as well. So yeah, it all feels very timely and the right thing to be happening.
Mm.
And it's great to be working with you and Louise on it as well.
Hello, likewise. And so just currently, if you could explain or pinpoint, what are your sort of main areas of interest at the moment, and are they different to perhaps what they were 4 or 5 years ago? What's your sort of, what's consuming your passions and your thought at the moment?
Well, a massive thing that's shifted for me now is that I'm not really writing or really reading very much, because I'm finding it, difficult sort of health-wise to focus on those things. But what the silver lining of that is that I'm doing far more talking and teaching, and doing far more astrology than I used to. As far as my interests go, I mean, my interests have always remained the same. I've always remained absolutely passionate about bridge building between one's sort of deep sense of one's own kind of spiritual path, or sense of the sacred, sense of personal development, personal transformation through study, and the material that's being studied. I don't think that'll ever change. I mean, that was there right from the very beginning. When we very first started our teaching at Kent University, there was this sort of sense that we needed to connect with people's religious, spiritual paths, as well as the academic study. So that's what's always sort of fired me, and continues to do so. And I suppose over the years, it's sort of morphed a bit from studying the Renaissance, studying Ficino, studying Neoplatonism and esotericism, and it's morphed more into a kind of transformative learning kind of framework, where all those subjects and topics become connected with more contemporary ideas of intuitive and imaginative research methods and projects. So since we've been in the education faculty at Christchurch, it's the idea of transformative learning as sort of an all-inclusive umbrella that can combine esoteric wisdom with spiritual practice and personal reflection and creative projects. Obviously, it's all come together into this big sort of pool of which we've been able to call transformative learning. So I guess that's how it's sort of changed. So I've started off very much with studying Ficino and studying the Renaissance, and it's sort of over 20 years or so morphed into a whole project of transformative learning. Yeah.
That's fascinating. And I think it's taking that idea, isn't it, of something that we can see as just as a theory, or conceptualize these areas perhaps of interest, whether it's Renaissance, philosophy, psychology, and somehow allow that to become not just a concept, but these ways in which you live and understand yourself and the world, and that informs the areas that you choose to study as well and pursue academically or for personal transformation and personal development.
Yeah, well, that's the whole premise of the sort of esoteric traditions, isn't it? It's about a living sort of spiritual fount of wisdom. So it's always baffled me how you could possibly study that from a kind of detached academic kind of objective viewpoint, because to study it means living it. How can you do otherwise? Or at least tasting it, at least entering into a sort of sympathetic relationship with it, even if not actually doing some of the practices. So I think it's impossible to, if you're going to study, really study the works of sort of really incredibly wise people such as Plotinus or Ficino or Plato or whoever, not to deeply question yourself as you do so. I mean, how can you not? Because that's what they're asking of you. So to be able to combine that, with the sort of critical academic study of the sort of culture and the history and the sources and everything, is quite a task, and it's very difficult. But it's a kind of alchemical task of bringing the opposites together, you know, of bringing the rational mind together with this deeply intuitive sense that we all have of being connected to something greater than ourselves, which has been the task, been the challenge, and it's not easy. But when we have little glimpses of it, you know, it's amazing. And I think one of the most satisfying things has been to see, you know, when the students have these glimpses in their essays and their projects, and you can see that they have brought these things together, and it's very exciting for them and for us, and makes the whole thing worthwhile, really.
Absolutely. Well, I can certainly vouch for that myself, having had, you know, a complete wake-up call during, I think it was my second essay, when I was working with a particular image, with one of the questions about, that was based on Mariangelo's teachings, James Elkins as well. There was plenty of Jung and McGilchrist in there too, and your work, and being invited to actually participate with an image in an imaginal way, and in a more affective, responsive, emotional way, and understanding how to locate that emotional response in a much larger picture of meaning. And it was literally like this sort of you know, wake up moment. It was this sort of aha moment, you know, which was quite remarkable. So in terms of your own journey, if you like, and how you got to where you are today, has it been a sort of straightforward, fairly linear path, or has it taken lots of twists and turns and lots of self-questioning? So that's one thing I wanted to ask you. Then the other part I wanted to ask you afterwards was a questioning of sort of aspects of the dark night of the soul, which is very connected to a sort of Christian tradition, and a less of a sort of Neoplatonic tradition, which tends to talk of the sort of loss of wings in a way of the soul in a very different way. So that's a sort of second part I wanted to ask you. But if you could just sort of take us through your childhood, really, the sort of early years and then into your teens, and what were the things that sparked your interest there?
Okay, well, I had a very conventional childhood, really. I mean, I'm an only child, and my parents were not really at all interested in anything to do with spirituality or religion. It just didn't impinge on their lives at all in any way. Although my mother, they're both artists, interestingly, and my mother was very poetic and wrote stories and poems. So they both were very artistic, but not religious or spiritual in any way, and they wouldn't have connected the two. But I remember when I was quite young, maybe about 10 or so, my father had a friend who would sometimes visit, who was very interested in things like paranormal experiences and UFOs and all sorts of weird and wonderful things. And he would sort of tell me about that, all this, with great enthusiasm. And it was like he sort of opened a world to some other dimension of experience, you know, a whole other worlds that my parents would never ever think about or talk about, that I remember feeling really excited about and thinking, wow, you know, and I used to kind of want to talk to him for hours about all these things. But I was also playing music, and so I suppose that was a kind of little awakening kind of thing that happened. But also I discovered Renaissance music, you know, when I was in my early teens, and that was absolutely major inspiration, and I just had an overwhelming sense of affinity with that period. So the first time I heard sort of 16th century music, which happened to be on the television series The Six Wives of Henry VIII, it was just like a recognition of, wow, this is where I kind of lived, breathed. This was somehow part in my bones. There's something about this period. I became completely obsessed by the Renaissance. By the time I was 16, I was playing the lute, and I was, you know, just painting and drawing Renaissance houses and people, and listening to endless music, and particularly Monteverdi, who's always been a great love of mine, while all my friends were going to discos and things. So you know, my teenage years were quite unusual in that respect, in that I discovered this identity, I discovered this period that was just, I couldn't get enough of, you know, through the arts. And so then I was learning the violin and the piano anyway, and I started learning the lute, and I started learning the viol when I went to university, and then I did diploma in early music after I left university, where I did modern languages and music, and I was all set really to have a career in music. I was all set to really develop a kind of career in early music, which I did for about almost 15 years. So that sort of began to happen in my early 20s, and I guess the great sort of catalyst, or the most important thing that happened in my early 20s, was that I met well, two things really. I met Anthony Rooley and worked for him. He was the director of the Consort of Music, an early music group. I also joined the School of Economic Science, which is a philosophy school in London, esoteric philosophy school in London. And they both introduced me to Ficino. They both introduced me to his letters, particularly. And Anthony Rooley was very, very interested in the sort of philosophy behind Renaissance music performance practice. And so I began to become completely fascinated in, well, what was it that was informing the ethos of performance of Renaissance music, which led me to the sort of whole Platonic revival in the Renaissance, and then Ficino, and the fact that he was an astrologer and a musician. And I started learning astrology at the same time. So everything sort of happened in my mid-20s to start bringing things together, discovering Ficino, discovering astrology, and then realizing that I really, it wasn't enough just to be playing the music. I needed to be studying it. I really wanted to study the whole philosophy of the period, and as well as the music, and Ficino himself. And it was almost like Ficino came and sort of tapped me on the shoulder and said, well, so this was back in the sort of late 80s, where he said, you know, no scholar really so far has been able to justify my practice of astrology, you know, within the academic fields, because they've always been rather embarrassed by it, because astrology was always such a, you know, seen as such an intellectually inferior subject and practice. So nothing really much had been written really showing how astrology and music were integral to Ficino's Platonism and the whole revival of Platonism and Neoplatonism, you know, in the 15th century. And it's like he just said to me, you've got to do it. You've got to do it. And it was like I had no choice. So well, first of all, I did an MA in music performance practice, and in which I gave a recital, but also wrote an MA thesis on his music. And then I just went on to do a PhD on his astrological music therapy. And it was tough because I was being drawn into this world I was being drawn into a totally male intellectual circle, you know, of 15th century elite humanists, and who were all directing their sort of passions towards a kind of transcendent feminine, I guess. You know, and there's absolutely no women mentioned in Ficino's letters at all, apart from his mother and his grandmother once, who were clairvoyants, which is interesting.
Oh, really? Were they?
So the whole time I was writing my PhD, I was just struggling so much with the sort of what to do with my femininity, you know, whilst I was being drawn into this group of elite male society. And that was the biggest struggle for me doing the PhD. And it was obviously part of something I had to go through to recognize the divine masculine in some sense, perhaps. I don't know. But so yes, that was the sort of huge thing that happened to me in my 20s, and which took me onto the path that I then followed.
So prior to actually delving into studying Ficino and music more in depth, in your teens, when you first discovered Renaissance music, and you were sort of fairly obsessed with the Renaissance in general, what was it about it that was inspiring you, if you didn't really know that much about it at the time? Was it just a sense? Was it an intuitive sense? Was it, I know it's very difficult to describe these intangibles in that way, but was it the sort of something it invoked in your imagination, or sort of ancient memory of something?
Definitely an ancient memory. And the music in particular, I just felt lifted me to a kind of I suppose a kind of consciousness that no other music did. It's very difficult to explain. It's like it kind of took me onto a bit of a sort of knife edge of a kind of, well, I later began to realize that this is what the sort of Hermetic texts talk about as a sort of divine discontent. It's like a kind of, when great art or music that resonates with you kind of takes you to that point where you feel you're glimpsing something beyond the human, so beyond the human realm and beyond the sort of sensory realm, but you can't get there. You can just have these glimpses of it. And of course I've come to understand that far more in a sort of Neoplatonic context now, but then it was just like evoking this immense longing for something I couldn't put into words. So when I was just sort of sitting for hours with headphones on, listening to Monteverdi's Vespers, which I did almost every day, it was like because I was wanting that kind of intoxication of being connected to this other realm I couldn't really articulate, and it would just, I would just be weeping, with longing for it. And that's what I remember feeling first of all. And then when I discovered the whole Neoplatonic framework of sort of cosmology and the sort of human being's place in it, that longing all began to make sense as to what I was longing for, which was reconnection with a sort of divine, universal origin or something. And yes, I guess that's what I experienced at first.
So how would you articulate that sort of connection now? Or it's a relationship really, isn't it? Connection's almost a too weak a word, but how would you articulate that relationship now that you have got the background knowledge to understand a little as to what was going on back then, this sort of yearning and longing that was unfulfilled in some way, but that you're sensing there's something else there? So how has that how did it inform you differently and change your course of your life once you did discover what was behind it?
Well, I guess it's always been a very unifying principle. So when people say, oh, I keep my academic work completely separate from my personal life, or my academic work completely separate from my spiritual practice, whatever, that's never made sense to me, because this sense of longing and connection, it's very erotic, in a sort of Platonic sense and it informs everything. So it would be impossible for me to do anything, or to kind of start out on some kind of deeply meaningful project without that sense behind it. So whether it was a sort of personal love affair, or whether it was a academic project of writing something, it was exactly the same impulse that was driving it, and I could never see them as separate. I never have been able to see them as separate. So it's that sort of, I've had glimpses of it when writing. I've had these glimpses of when these two things have come together, and that force has sort of come through, and then one loses it very easily. Or when playing music, or when you're in love with someone, this is the same feeling, and it's the same sort of life force that wants to come through. So I suppose I sort of see it like that. Maybe that answers the question.
Yes. But did you ever have any I mean, aside from when you were doing your PhD on Ficino and you were discovering this sort of very male world of the 15th century Renaissance humanists, which was very male dominated, but even though they were sort of reviving this wonderful divine feminine aspect throughout the arts and music and literature. But have you ever had a real sort of dark night of the soul, as they would sort of call it in the sort of Christian sense, I suppose, or this sense of what I think Plotinus calls it, this loss of wings, you know, the sort of loss of soul, where you just sort of think, I'm just not on the right path at all? And has anything ever sort of happened that's literally sort of jolted you back onto it? Or have you always sort of felt you've pretty much been where you need to be?
That's a very interesting question. I kind of feel there's been something sort of guiding me along the path I'm meant to be on. And I suppose the biggest jolt was that sort of put me onto track was when I'd finished my PhD and I was in London. So I was about sort of 35 or so, 36. I think my oldest son was about 1 at that point. And I met, somebody introduced me to a group that met in London, led by Julianne McLean, who's a Jungian analyst. And at this group were Leon Schlam and Joseph Milne, who both taught at the University of Kent. And so I got to know them, and they ran an extraordinary MA program at Kent called Study of Mysticism and Religious Experience. And I was kind of, you know, I had a sort of baby and I was finished my PhD and I was thinking, well, what's going to happen next? And I had no idea what was going to happen next. And Leon said, well, if you moved to Kent, you could come and teach a course on Ficino for the MA. So that was the turning point, really. That was the opportunity. That was the opening. So we moved to Kent, and I just started teaching a module on Ficino for their MA program. And it just so happened that Geoffrey Cornelius, you know, our colleague, had also moved to Kent, quite near, funnily enough, although we hadn't realised that. So he started also beginning to teach some material on divination and astrology for this MA program. That was the first turning point. The second turning point was about a few years after we started doing this. A huge sum of money just fell into our laps from, you know, the Sophia Trust, because they wanted to bring astrology into higher education. And out of that developed the first MA program at Kent. And we were just in the right place at the right time, and the money was there, and it sort of fell into our laps. And I didn't have to, you know, apply for a job or do any kind of interview. I was just there, and there was the money. And that I regard as an amazing kind of act of providence in some way, because that started everything off.
Absolutely.
So they were the sort of major sort of catalysts that got everything going. I mean, in terms of dark nights of the soul, I think my dark nights of the soul have definitely been far more personal. You know, they've been to do with the kind of despair one feels over difficult relationships. I've never had any dark nights of the soul over my career path, which has just simply flowed along amazingly, really. My dark nights have always been about unrequited love. But, you know, even that I see as part of the whole process, you know, part of the whole picture. But yeah, so from then it just sort of flowed on, really, until the money ran out in 2011, and we were ejected from Kent. And then I suppose the next catalyst, or the thing that shifted us on, was meeting Wilma Fraser at Canterbury Christchurch in the education faculty, who ran the adult education program there, who Geoffrey and I taught for a while, who was determined to get the MA program going at Christchurch because she just loved it so much. And her PhD obviously was on Sophia and feminine wisdom in adult education. So she helped us developed the program which started at Christchurch in 2014. So there've been these people, you know, along the way in my life that have been these little catalysts for helping sort of this project sort of move along and get going. And so that's all how it happened there. So I think probably, I mean, there was a bit of a dark night. There was a little bit of, I guess, of kind of wondering how on earth things were going to happen in between the courses at Kent and Christchurch. But I was also teaching at the University of Exeter on their MA in Western Esotericism. So that was a whole other sort of branch that was led by Nicholas Goodrich Clark. And that ended when he died, I think in 2012. And he inspired me to, or he commissioned me really to write a little book on Ficino that I wrote. So yes, I've had people, there have been people, you know, out there who have been the catalysts for allowing me to continue on this path. I'm extremely grateful for. And of course, perhaps the greatest one of all has been Jeffrey, who's just been the most incredible inspiration to me since, you know, the 80s. I just feel the work he's done in divination is just absolutely extraordinary and deserves far wider recognition, really. And he's such a wonderful teacher as well.
Could you tell us a little bit about that time when this particular event happened, the music event, that there were a number of sort of synchronistic events that happened before that, or was it after it, that then led to the money funding for the course at Kent? And you said that there was a card that Jeffrey sent you, or you sent a card, or somebody had sent a card to Jeffrey.
Oh,
Giorgione's image, was it Giorgione's image, I think?
Oh yes, Giorgione's image, which I have got here, and I can.
That's the one.
Yes, the astrologer.
But was that linked to the music performance?
Yes. Oh well, this has got a very lovely story attached to it. This beautiful image of a young man playing a lira da braccio with an astrologer at sunrise. Yes, so in the year 2000, I was fortunate enough to. Now, how did it start? It started when I gave a talk on Ficino at a conference in the National Gallery in the year 2000 or 1999, around about then, and talked about Ficino's music and played an excerpt from a concert that I'd given with some friends, which had been a sort of recreation of his Orphic singing. So I made a recording of the hymn to the sun, the Orphic hymn to the sun. I played it at this conference, and you know, it had been a whole weekend of rather dry academic papers, and then the very last session was mine, and I talked about the music and actually played this piece of music, and everyone was completely sort of transfixed. And after that, there was the offer of sponsoring a recording, a CD, making a CD of sort of recreating Ficino's Orphic singing with music of the period. And the people, the School of Economic Science it was actually, who sponsored this, were also friends with Mark Rylance. And so he became involved in it. And we, yes, it was the most amazing project of making a CD of Ficino's music with some lovely singers and with Mark Rylance reading Ficino's words about each planet. So it takes you through a sort of planetary sequence from the moon to Saturn. And when we were in preparation for making this, it was my ex-brother-in-law actually who sent me this image, just because he knew I liked Renaissance music. And I was showing this to Jeffrey one day in my house, and the telephone rang, and it was Mark Tucker, who was the singer on our recording, and he rang to tell me that he just had a dream where he was a sort of young man in white, you know, sitting next to an older man, and he was sort of singing and playing, and I said, oh, you've just described in this picture, this is your dream kind of thing. And
remarkable.
And Jeffrey and I thought, well, what's this about? And we we decided it was about trying to record the hymns at the correct planetary hours, because the old man's holding an hourglass here as if he's sort of measuring the planetary hours. And the important thing in Renaissance natural magic, you know, is that you perform your rituals at the right time. You calculate the right astrological time to do it. So that was one of those slightly spine-tingling kind of synchronicities that happened. And then the actual recording itself, that we spent a weekend making it, sort of invoking deities the whole weekend, was another massive turning point in my life, because through various circumstances which I won't go into, I just knew when I got back after doing that I had to change my life completely, and basically leave my husband and, you know, make major personal changes in my life. So it was a huge catalyst on many levels. And then we also performed it live in a church in London, in St Bartholomew the Great, an ancient church. So we were performing ancient hymns at the high altar of a Christian church with the right incenses for each deity. Amazing. And the people there said it was an extraordinary experience, and it was just like a kind of, you know, bringing Ficino alive again after 500 years or so. So I've done some extraordinary things, and I also went on 2 pilgrimages to Mount Olympus before each MA program, in order to kind of invoke the blessings of the gods.
Well, it's obviously worked, Angela.
Yes,
it's worked.
Well, it's worked.
Yeah. It really has. No, it's incredible listening to it, because, you know, these things do work. I mean, you know, it might be wonderful to do another performance one day in the not too distant future of Ficino's music, if it's that incredibly evocative and life changing. And it's also something I think that affects people around us in the world. I mean, we sort of need something like that at the moment, I think, especially due to our current circumstances with you know, our current pandemic and everything.
Yeah, and I've had so much, you know, wonderful kind of like fan mail, and kind of, you know, I've had so many responses from people all over the world about, well, both what I've written and the music, you know, and it kind of, I don't know, I sort of feel like, I mean, I don't want to sound sort of overblown and sort of pompous about this at all, but I understand what Ficino says when he says that he felt that his destiny was to bring together Jupiter and Saturn. You know, that he always felt his destiny was to bring together philosophy and religion, reason and imagination, you know, these opposites. And I just feel I've sort of been following in his footsteps in that sense, and that has been my destiny too, you know, to bring these things together. And I think when people recognize that, it sort of brings it together for them as well. And I just feel immensely grateful, you know, for these opportunities I've had in my life. It's been quite magical, really.
It is magical. I mean, listening to it from my point of view, and I know you, and I know a lot of it, but I didn't know it all. And it is magical. And also, I think for the individual person to feel that, you know, you're not just a sort of pod on the planet that's misdirected and sort of randomly being buffered about. I think if you are able to connect with your passion and those things that really make your heart sing, it directs the course of your life.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I've never really doubted it. I remember being asked a question once in an interview, you know, how did you manage to, you know, have an academic career in such an extraordinary sort of subject? And it's just like, well, I didn't set out to have an academic career in an extraordinary subject. It's just because it's something I loved and I wanted to do, and I just did it, and it just sort of came from somewhere without a sort of conscious intention. You know, it was just like an unfolding. I think it's like, you know, James Hillman's sense of this, you know, the inner diamond, that if you allow it to speak and unfold, it will direct your life. And there may be unexpected twists and turns, and there may be times when it feels like things are happening that are really awful, but then in retrospect you realize that the next step couldn't have happened, you know, if that thing hadn't happened to you. So I've always had an optimism, I think, and faith in the sense that things, if you follow that thread inside yourself, things will unfold in the right way. But so often we're distracted from it for all sorts of reasons, you know, like, I don't know, having to earn money or expectations of parents or whatever. But I think I've always been pretty determined to follow it.
I think they're very wise words of wisdom to end on. It's fantastic. Thank you, Angela, so much. That was absolutely brilliant.
Oh, thanks, Mary. It's lovely to talk to you.
Fascinating. Thank you.